But there are terms and concepts that exist within Indian culture. It's that notion of the sense of self with the term Ahamkara. It's the tattva, it's the category of consciousness, which is inseparable from what we consider our mind, inseparable from the functioning of the higher quality of the mind as intellect. And there are Sanskrit terms for that, which comprises in itself the inner organ known as antakarana. The inner organ is here of tremendous importance because it's spoken of as the conglomerate which makes higher mind and the lower mind, or as it is spoken of in these esoteric traditions of Tantra and Sufism as the heart.
But yeah, great to have you here and really appreciate you taking the time, Igor. So the way that I discovered you recently was I had a experience at a 10-day Vipassana meditation retreat, and I all of a sudden on about day 5, my body started moving on its own. You know what I mean? Which took me pretty by surprise, and also the people at the retreat as well. It seems they didn't have a lot of understanding or depth of understanding or anything about that. There was a little bit of like, I forget what the exact term is, but in the Vipassana, they've got samsara or ankaras or something that means the conditionings in the body. And they were like, yeah, sometimes there can be a little bit of movement when some of those come out or whatever. And I was like, hey, yeah, back in my room last night, this wasn't just a little bit of movement. You know what I mean? This was a elaborate yoga, and I don't know how to do this yoga. And so that really sparked for me a little bit of a journey of looking into whether anyone knew anything about this. You know, as you may have had a similar experience yourself of sort of being thrust into that. And, you know, some of my background, I've got Bachelor of Biomedical Science. I'm a little bit intellectually rigorous normally, you know what I mean? And so this is well outside of my comfort zone and my space of understanding. And I came up against, you know, I was reaching out to various different yoga people and these people and people even doing what was Kundalini yoga and different things, and no one knew anything about this, you know what I mean? And so I found you and was like, oh my God, someone is not just knows about this, but you seem to be a real force of information and intellect on this area, you know, and I'm sure other adjacent areas as well. But that was really refreshing, also great, you know, as an experience to be able to be like, okay, there's some grounding for this, because, you know, everyone in your life that's uninitiated into this sort of thing, including me a couple of years ago, is just like, I don't know what to tell you. You know what I mean? Like that sounds all very well and interesting, but I'm not sure if that's okay, or, you know, there's no real depth of understanding there. So that was a bit of my journey. Found you, real breath of fresh air. I thought that you spoke really well. You spoke within the bounds of logic and left room for the mystery, and you have this deep Eastern philosophical sort of underpinnings and a great understanding of the space. So that for me was sort of how I got into you. And I looked at a lot of your stuff, and I thought it was really, really fascinating that you'd sort of made this area your own niche in a way. You know what I mean? Is it something that you've been through and you developed, you know, I don't know how much of the information you had beforehand, but you've obviously developed quite a considerable body of understanding and the frameworks, and those are the ones that you need to look for, in my understanding here, because there's nothing on the western side of the river here in terms of when these things happen. And, you know, that's what I'd like to get into with you a little bit of how rare your perception of these sorts of things are, and we might start there with just how do you interface with the how common this experience is to sort of be thrust upon someone in this way, and also in your retreats, which I've looked a little bit of the stuff. Is this something that you try or facilitate the catalyzation of, or the arising of, in someone who hasn't had it happen yet, or do you mainly work with people who have already awoken this sort of thing spontaneously, and then you deepen it, and you give a platform and a grounds for sort of exploring it and letting it do what it wants to do, so to speak. That's probably the first place I'd like to jump in.
Well, what you've touched upon, it's like, I mean, man, well, we've got to really separate wheat from the chaff here when it comes to this. So before I even begin to answer any of this, we first need to disentangle quite a bit of that, what knotted itself, and
Yep.
perhaps it took a while to form into that knots of confusion, I would say, over the perhaps a longer period of time than we think of it in terms of how the West understands this, let's say, and treats this as a phenomena. So, but before going the head on, I'd like to maybe rewind a little bit to where you have started. It kind of could be taken by myself erroneously as a compliment that I carved out this niche for myself. And it does not give me any, I would say, laying cards on the table, joy to say that over so many years, certain misunderstanding, misconception continues being accepted as a given in so many, I would say, meditation-based approaches, methodologies, and even including those that link themselves to tradition, great tradition that comes from Indian subcontinent, that it baffles me that there is perhaps some greater consensus that is being held back, you see? And that's why I think it's we would have to touch up on the culturally held consensus in terms of what is considered to be, let's say, legitimate, normal, rational, explainable, packageable. And what we mean by that, it's not a secret that spirituality today is a commodity. It is a commodity for a long period of time already. So therefore, with that, certain, let's say, products are easier to package and promote and sell. Whereas some product is, as it were, like, can we just lower the plant for a moment and maybe take it easy? Like, I grew up in Uzbekistan, Central Asia, and it's interesting that certain fruits are not at all marketable.
Yeah.
Like, have you ever thought, I don't know, mulberry? Mulberry is a fruit.
Yeah.
And
There's
it's
a
a very
mulberry tree out the
famous,
front here.
yeah, there we go. Mulberry is an amazing fruit, packed with nutrition. In Central Asia, it enjoys a mythical kind of reputation, like apparently the army of Alexander the Great, when they had to cross the Hindu Kush mountains to enter India, which is the single only passage that connects Central Asia with India, northern India that is, which is crossable. They had to, the only way they made it is because purportedly they all had the lump of dried, compressed mulberry
Mulberries.
to keep them going, because it oxidizes the blood and the brain because of its properties whilst you're at such high altitude. So anyways, mulberry, you can't just walk into supermarket and buy mulberry because it's simply not transportable. It's not your blueberry or even raspberry, let alone Cavendish bananas. It's like, it's really, really impossible to transport far. Yet I grew up in culture where mulberry is sold in large, containers in the market, and they sell them very quick, like literally, like you come and the woman just calls you. Why am I giving this analogy is that because it's a visceral analogy that not everything can be packaged in the way that we prefer as consumers, you see, to receive. So this is maybe will give us like that semi-poetic, metaphoric entrance into the topic. And what we discuss here, what we set to discuss, what is your own point of inquiry, which you have, I believe, simply, forgive me for this, wet your toes with, right? Because what happened to you is not uncommon these days, and only heralds the process which I today boldly define as activation of pranic force, aka in Sanskrit pranotthana, which is distinct from fully blown Kundalini awakening, because that's what really this conversation, as far as I understand, leaning towards eventually, and we would have to go there, because all this somatic display, all these manifestations, they are linked intimately with the working of the pranic body as we know it, let's say, from the yoga, in terms of that whole greater body. Because maybe for the listeners it's very important, those who are not initiated into these practices, into these traditions, there is a great distinction when we say the body in the Western, let's say, with the Western understanding, we somehow limit that to the physical body. But for someone who grows up in the culture where it is spoken about at great length and potentially depth, body is not pertaining only to the physical body. So this concept of sarira or sharira, sarira, in Sanskrit denotes the body, and everything is made out of progressively subtler bodies. So this whole concept of panchakoshas, staple stuff of any yoga teacher training program, one would have to dive into that, right? Yep. Made of these progressively subtler layers, starting with that what is made out of food we eat on a daily basis, which nourishes and replenishes our cells, so that annamaya kosha, that, and then all the way to the body of bliss, or the layer of bliss. So the pranic body is what connects the physicality, let's say, what connects the physical matter here, right? The tissues, all the 7 tissues, from saliva in our mouth, as that, let's say, rasa, dhatu, the plasma, all the way to reproductive tissue, which is a byproduct of all digestive processes. So even here, the view on the body, esoterically speaking from that great tradition that born, thrived, and still exists in Indian subcontinent, the body here is a very complex system, sophisticated to the degree that our modern science barely scratches the surface. So this body is in turn connects to the progressively subtler degrees of what we call mind and intellect, and eventually to the outer layer of that layer of bliss, that anandamaya kosha. And that bliss is what in turn connects us to the entire creation as we know it or as we don't know it. So we are these walking units, right, of individual experience, whilst at the very same time we are also an encapsulated unit of universe, macrocosm and microcosm, meets, intermingle, interact, vibrate, and correspond to the furthest corners of that universe with its inner core at all times. So, and the pranic sheet or the pranic layer, right, is what makes this interaction possible. So in cases when there's something that causes let's say, greater vibration in the pranic body, And that could be caused by application of spiritual methodologies, like in your case, being in Vipassana retreat, that it's directed at that, right? It's designed, it's catered, it's has a certain system. Or it can happen to an average Joe who is unaware of it all, goes happy-go-lucky about his day, but something happens, that's some jolt, emotional, there's some shock, there's something that, let's say, throws the system out of its normal, in inverted commas, gridlock of affairs. And that jolt could facilitate this activation of pranic activity. What does it do? At a minimum, it will simply put in touch one with a lot of what you have experienced as that sense of, well, it could be, depends, of course, on our predispositions. Maybe we can touch up on that later. Predispositions which play here quite an interesting and important role, but also depends, of course, and that in turn is colored by these predispositions of how we will read into that. So if someone, let's say, is more esoterically aligned, one would be in touch with that what is a direct experience of something irrational, magical. Suddenly the body moves on its own. Suddenly the limbs, the breath does what one not necessarily wants to do.
Yeah.
And it could be done in a chaotic, it could be done in semi-chaotic, it could be done in highly orchestrated manner. So of course, this includes the whole rich vocabulary of vocal expressions, from speaking in tongues to uttering unknown languages, to expressing oneself in voices one did not know exist. Like literally one can screech, begin to speak what I define myself in my work, language of the birds.
Yeah.
It could be suddenly displaying nothing short of extraordinary vocal abilities. Just to maybe say, this is where the work I do is particularly known for, where people could hold notes that they will not be able to hold in normal life, even if some of them, and they are also in our work, cases of trained singers, bhajan singers, kirtan singers, just pop singers. They cannot hold note that long. It's an operatic manner of singing. It's someone begins to sing from the belly, which requires training. It's a totally different kind of display. So all this, of course, can put one in touch with the magical side of life. If someone is less inclined and has a much more rationally driven upbringing and culturally shared consensus where everything is explainable, it can really create a lot of discontent, instill some fear. It could shake someone to the core, depending on the intensity of the process. But all this is due to the sudden or progressive activation of pranic currents, which conduct accordingly all affairs in the house. You can go into that if you'd like, why and what here is in charge, but this is the, let's say, the immediate explanation. And if I may add to your sharing, is that this does not give me any joy, let alone making me feel chuffed that I'm somehow carved this uncharted territory for myself, because I think it's the other way around. I was thrusted into this area, even though when I came out to work with people in terms of making that conscious decision, because for me it was a prolonged period of time. If you looked up my background, I've been an artist pretty much all my life until my mid-30s. And I was a successful artist. I've lived beautiful, very fulfilling life of a painter in London. So I was like, there was no indications that I should put my paints and my, brushes aside and do something else. But it took me quite a few years before I made that complete and utter transition. So when I entered into the public sphere, which also coincided immediately with speaking at the conferential spaces back then, I find myself suddenly appalled by the state of, let's put it, not really truly knowing what's going on. At the very same time, it would not be fair if we don't say and mention that there are crevices and pockets within, let's say, spiritual communities which have been doing their best. I mean, in these pockets, there are some individuals, some of them alive to this day, with some of them I have a very good connection, who have been, effectively speaking, dedicating their whole life in doing exactly that, educating. So it goes to mention names of Dr. Stuart Savatsky, who has inherited the Institute for Kundalini Research from Lisa Nella, a legendary person who has inaugurated and established this institute in California back in the days. We're talking about the 70s. And this, of course, Stanislav and Christina Grof with the seminal work, Spiritual Emergency, where that very term has been coined as the cover title of the book, which was a collection of essays commissioned by several peers in the field back in the days, in early 80s, to address this phenomena, which would by then started to occur in the West more and more frequently. So there are pockets, you see, within the spiritual community, whilst by large, there is still a lot of biases, dismissals, and frankly speaking, often irresponsible attitudes towards really what this potentially entails, comprises of, because I hope we can touch upon the disparity between clinically cut approaches and teachings, what could be given umbrella of non-duality or neo-Advaita, and the messy process of the actual awakening.
Yeah.
I don't want to jump in immediately there, so I'll just maybe give it back to you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and that does give some context and helps understand. And I didn't mean to say that you'd sort of intentionally carved out a niche, more so that you'd just been sharing into the space and people came and sort of sat, but a certain crowd was really drawn to sitting before you. And, the situation that I found myself in of scouring the entire internet for information and finding nothing but you know what I mean, that resonated experientially with, this guy is talking about what I'm experiencing, you know what I mean, versus other people, even people that have as I mentioned, the full thing is they do Kriya yoga or Kundalini yoga or whatever they do. It's a completely different thing to when this process arises spontaneously, and so it's a really interesting space that you've sort of created there. And I know it would have been a long journey for yourself to get there. And just as you're speaking there, it's making me think of, this has probably always been happening, and in the Western sort of context, things that are jumping to mind for me are like, demonic possession and witch trials and all of these different things that occurred across time, was probably where all of this pranic stuff that you're mentioning was lumped into. You know what I mean? Something we don't know what to do with. Let's kill them or burn them or lock them up or whatever, because when you've had these sorts of experiences and the body moves in different ways, and things start happening. And as you're saying, even those vocalizations and everything like that, that seems to all be a bucket of what would have been spontaneously happening ambiently in the human population. A certain percentage, as you're saying, of just average Joes or people that are making a dedicated and a concerted sort of spiritual effort, contemplatives or ascetics or whatever, across time have been tapping into these sorts of things. But I think as a culture in the West, it's incredibly naive. But in the East, I think, as you're saying, that there's a wide body of experts and lineages that know how to work with these things and have developed a sophistication around that. And as someone in the West, unfortunately, I'm ignorant to all of that. You know what I mean? And so it's only when I interface experientially with something, a good word, as you mentioned from the Groffs, a spiritual emergency sort of, that's what it feels like, you know what I mean? And only then do you go looking for an answer. Before that, you didn't know what you didn't know, you know what I mean? And so that there's a bit of a gap there. But yeah, it just touching a little more on how my experience sort of developed across is that I had that time at the retreat. The movements became more and more and more intense, and my relationship with them was a state of felt like a trance, almost like a, probably bad word, but a possession, you know what I mean? And I was kicked out of the retreat because they told me stop moving, and I said, I don't know, as you may have known, it might have been a bit different in your experience, but as I let the movements come through, they became more and more intense to the point where it felt like stopping it was almost impossible. It felt impossible, but it also felt intuitively very sacred and wise, and it felt like a force that was a lot wiser than the person that was telling me to stop moving. And so I said, in the dedicated sits in the hall, I'll stop moving. And he said, no, even in your room, you have to stop moving. And I said, I'm going to have to go. And I went home and just for about 8 to 10 hours each day, I gave myself over to these movements. They turned into elaborate yoga flows with a lot of things that made me very uncomfortable. There was processes of release and tears and shaking, and it felt like it was leading me and guiding me, this energy, to knotted up areas of my body, mind, my pranic sort of experience. It felt like it was taking me to areas that were bunched up energy, kinetic energy almost, and then when I consciously would release into it, I would melt into it, and it would release into surrounding tissues and dissipate. And then that happened over and over. There was a few big ones, and then it just turned into, I sit and instantly it can take over, and it will just do these yoga postures with me, which left me, being in a fairly constipated sort of intellectual, I had space for certain things, but it wasn't something where I wasn't going to yoga or teacher trainings and things like that. I'd done maybe 2 or 3 yoga classes with my mum, and it was well outside of my comfort zone, and it ended up where I would sit and my body would just do yoga. So I was faced with forced the realization upon me of, okay, so the body knows elaborate yoga inbuilt within my nervous system somewhere. In my mind, it was eating, drinking, reproduction, attraction, these basic human forces that were stored, and the rest was learned information. I had to somehow slot in there advanced yoga postures. You know what I mean? I was born in with advanced sort of, and these are sort of postures that don't look like a lot of the stuff that I see when people do a yoga flow or whatever. There is some of the movements of the hands and energy and different things like that, but a lot of it is like this arm around here, this one in here, foot up there, and it's like it's doing 3, 4 things at once. Like it's a multimodal, and when it has that specific character, it quite quickly turns into, the sacredness of it is inherent. It's intuitive. It's like, I know because of what this is doing with my body, this is doing things with the body that I would never consider possible or safe or reasonable. And that character to it really hit home for me, the sort of the sacred nature of it, of like, this thing is doing things that I know aren't coming from at least my mind. You know what I mean? They're not coming from my intellect. It might be the deepest level of the body, or it might be energy. I'm sort of open to any interpretations at this point, because the experiential nature is undeniably sacred and wise. And I give over a couple hours every day to it at this point, and it works on different areas. It'll hit this vertebrae, then this one, then this one. Might spend 40 minutes on this one. Next day, it might be working on my lower back and doing different things. And there was a lot of time spent in my neck and in the areas where I had felt pain and tension a lot in my life. You've got those areas where you hold it. It really seems to work on those areas, and almost seems to be sort of lengthening things in preparation for some later thing. And I've had that move through in stages like that. But the real physicality, some of the things that you spoke about, I heard you in one thing say that you felt like your head was trying to look at your own tailbone sort of thing, and things like this. That was actually a really difficult part of the process for me, in terms of having the faith that I won't be hurt. You know what I mean? It sort of seems a bit trivial, but from the inside perspective, that was actually my main concern. And at certain points throughout the process, I stopped it and I said, no more. I'm not doing it anymore. I had stages where it sort of stretched things so much that the nerves, like things went numb. You know what I mean? Not like numb, like drop face, like motor neuron numb, but like sensory surface neuron numb. And it seemed to just be, I got the vibe that it was like, we're going to break a few eggs here, you know what I mean? But it was that they came back online pretty quick. But it was a vibe of like, you did a lot to get here. You're not going to get out of here without a few, broken eggs. But it fundamentally seems to be respectful of my physiology, and not at all. It knows to take you within a millimeter of something snapping, but it's entirely controlled within that bounds. And so, and I'd come to that conclusion my own through 2 or 3 bouts of no more, that's crazy, not doing it, like I don't care. And then, to hear you say the same conclusion that I'd come to, that it really won't injure you, and it's a wise sort of process. That was very gratifying to hear that, okay, someone else has come to the same conclusion. And now I have complete faith and trust in it, as long as I don't meddle with it, that it won't injure me. But for a time, that was huge. And, previously, before any of this, I did have a lot of body-based health sort of anxiety, you know what I mean? So for me, those areas were fairly sensitive pain points of like, I don't want to be damaging myself here. You know what I mean? That was a big deal. And so just that, to give some framing around how it ended up developing. And I had a bit of a relationship with it where I was like, I was scared it was going to go away because it felt so sacred. So I gave it a lot of time, probably too much time, maybe. You know what I mean? From some of the stuff I've heard you talk about, probably doing an 8-hour day is a little much on the nervous system, probably. But I felt like, what an opportunity to be given to experience this, what felt very sacred and divine intuitively, and even though, and who am I to not really explore it? You know what I mean? And so now I'm in a bit of a more relaxed relationship, because I've realized it's not going anywhere, for better or worse. It's a part of my experience, and now it's a bit more of a relaxed relationship. But on any given day, it still does whip up in intensity when it needs to the full, really fast. You know what I mean? It'll whip me around like I'm a willow branch in a storm, and it seems to be fairly chaotic and intense. Not chaotic, but intense. And then sometimes it'll just be a subtle, it always wants to do something, a lot with the neck for whatever reason. I don't know, you might know there, but there's a lot of action with the neck. It almost seems like other areas it works on, and then that frees up energy that gets stuck in the neck or something, and then it gets it out of the neck. And it seems to be very neck based. That could just be idiosyncratic to me, or a path of the course here, I'm not sure. But yeah, so that's just a bit more painting on how it ended up developing for me personally. And I'm not sure if you relate to that in terms of how your experience unfolded. I didn't hear too much in terms of exactly how it unfolded for you, and I know you're a little hesitant to give. It seemed like from some of the stuff I saw that you're not wanting to point, because it is such an individual process, it sounds like. And so would you be willing to share some of just sort of roughly how that unfolded for you, and whether it took you by such surprise as well when it happened, or whether you sort of had a bit more of a space for it and a platform to embrace it without so much of the neurotic approach that I sort of had.
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to remark, as a kind of immediate reflection to what you have shared based on your own experiences, that it also shows that innate intelligence at work, exemplified in your case, that you did not follow the instructions, even though it might have been for some as a, well, I'm here at the retreat, right? I'm in the hands of professionals, people who facilitate this work, so they know what they're talking about. So I ought to maybe listen, if not obey. Yet there was something in what you have shared that prompted you, intuition-based, right? That personal kind of response that, well, this is not something I can stop, and maybe more importantly, that I have to stop, right? So therefore, let's maybe begin kind of like unraveling this from there. And that, of course, still within that same trajectory of what is possible to truly package and truly present as a so-called product. And this, again, where we would have to kind of move between individual so-called experiences, personal journey, versus collectively shared consensus, versus what we have accumulated, including, let's say, the continuity of that, where these processes have been culturally for a very long time considered to be not just uneasy, but there are corresponding times where these processes, whenever they will erupt, and it's kind of like not even the best way to say that, because eruption often has these negative connotations, when they occur, would be then followed by, let's say, use this as a blanket term, witch hunt. So the kind of approaches that would be applied by institutionalized, by systems, which we know it historically, in many cases, well, maybe some listeners with the backgrounds in religion will feel this somewhat offensive. This is why I'm choosing these words carefully. At the same time, I don't want to beat about the bush too much, but there is this correlation between a free rising of true revelation and how then that is being institutionalized in the service of, frankly, ruling classes, frankly, geopolitical agendas, frankly, as a new administrative, let's say, tools to govern. This can be seen throughout the history of all religions, all of them. Even those religions we fall in love with, like Buddhism, did not escape that. Rudimentary insights and like detours into that shows us that even Buddhism was brought to India on spears and shields of dead and fire, and it was not different from Islam. So people who have this kind of naive perspectives that somehow some religions are more peaceful and other religions are more warrior-like, I think history and reality is much more complex. So what I'd like to point out in all this is that, interestingly, how the times when there is a great rigidity at once begins to display these occurrences, which in turn brings almost a counterwave of suppression. lately I have refreshed my knowledge of the Inquisition in Europe, how it coincided with, let's say, eradication of certain pockets of how there was this era was called, I forgot, there's a French word for it, Tor l'amour, something like that, where that whole culture of knights, relationship between the, let's say, the lady, where perhaps echoing the connection between courting of the goddess in the human form, this whole notions of chivalry, but where the masculine, let's say, part of the community who were educated, let's say, who would comprise the nobility at the time, would have to be, fully developed individuals, which will also comprise being deeply in touch with their feminine side through poetry, through courteous behavior, through, effectively speaking, what would make them nobles, not mere, let's say, craftsmen or peasants. And when that was crushed by the Vatican, as we know, the next wave was the witchcraft, not witchcraft, the witch hunt. The next wave immediately, because that created that kind of greater masculinization, denial of the feminine side, and the femininity began to be seen as threatening. I'm deliberately making this connection so that we see this as a continuation of that, let's say, whenever there is a disparity between, or imbalance maybe, between the masculine and the feminine, then it then displays itself often in a very ugly way.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, in a way of what we see as total militarization, militarized approaches of certain cultural consensus driven to the catastrophical proportions. Let's say like it happened in the militarized Nazi Germany, right? Which is highly masculinized, which was like bending almost towards that non-existent ideal, borrowing, cherry-picking certain ideological sprouts in the previous century to grotesquely distort them into what would fit the narrative. Now, let's say we put a pause there and transfer this into what each and every one of us experiencing on a daily basis. These dynamics, of course, always at play. So that masculine, feminine here is also often how yoga is being portrayed. And the alchemy itself is the appeasement and balance between these energies. Whenever one energy begins to dominate over the other, it brings what is then known as the imbalance. That imbalance then, first at the level of the psyche, begins to seep into the physiology. So the neurophysiology begins to be at the receiving end. So this we could maybe even invite some professionals in the field of neuroscience and certainly people in medical professions to see that rather than dismissing that, how that what we are faced with on an epidemic level, certain, let's say, illnesses that plaguing human race right now in this day and age, could be linked and traced to these deep imbalances within the psyche. I mean, already Carl Jung pointed out to that, deeply inspired by Tantra and Vedic thought, we know that without a doubt. His seminal work on, let's say, examining this from the point of view of Oriental tradition of India.
Mhm.
In his seminars on Kundalini, where he gave that model which he felt was lacking in Western thought per se, and he felt that if Western psychology has future, it needs to be truly aware of the complexities that the Indian civilization kept intact in its rich body of work on consciousness. And to this day, so that those who have, let's say, picked up from there and developed their own systems, like in the field of transpersonal psychology, this plays tremendous role. So in the evolution and development of a human being, these phases, of course, are known to be not homogeneous, and one cannot expect this balance to be there at all times. This balance is already disturbed in puberty. We know that, this is where this would have to take place within and at the level of the psyche because of necessary physiological developments. These physiological developments will then go hand in hand with what we call psychological development. So the physiological, psychological development here is often at the expense of one the other, until a certain convergence would have to be made. This is perhaps where spiritual traditions of the past have understood this and seen this as a necessity for having certain approaches so as to keep this area in check, intact, so that the development of a human being is more harmonious, because it is plugged and subjected to these inherent imbalances inherent in the way we are. I want to leave this out, for example, a very, very problematic and potentially explosive topic, because this also connects us squarely with prevalent in our days attitude and understanding towards who we are in our skin. And this is being polemized a lot these days, again, within the framework of, let's say, our current system of values, dubbed us or called us or referred to as liberal democracy, where our children can choose their gender at the age when they have no clue yet, psychologically, what it actually pertains, what it actually means. So the
No
teenager,
embodiment of it, really.
exactly, like they have a full ownership of their body, whereas their body is still in the stages of formation. And so this kind of, I'm bringing it all together. I hope you don't mind. So the conversation kind of maybe has potential marking this territory, so we can return to that, or you can return to that in your own work.
It's beautiful. Keep going.
Yeah. So now, once we lay this out, right, in the thesis kind of manner, I can go back to where you have shared your own journey and say that when I went to what is known as a advanced meditation program, TM-Siddhi program, TM-Siddhi course, back in the days when I was in my mid-30s. I was already prior to that meditator within the tradition of transcendental meditation, found by His Holiness Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, whose picture I have right here on my desk. And I wasn't, of course, expecting to go through life-changing journey, but I knew by then that this methodology, this program, is meant to accelerate these inherent potentials. Of course, nobody told me that it's going to facilitate what I went through to such degree and such manner. Not that I'm laying any blames on anyone, although with that being said, it's a kind of like both blessing in disguise, silver lining, what have you. But one way or another, there are some similarities, even though I could say that I was perhaps a bit more prepared because I was already dabbing, certainly, into Indian philosophy as far back as my late 20s. There was this departure in my interest. I've always been interested in philosophy. I've spoken about it in my earlier interviews, and many of them, the interest ranging from, let's say, existentialist school, exemplified by Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, to Schopenhauer, to Nietzsche, and culminating in Martin Heidegger, which in turn brought me to my interest in pre-Socratics and where it all started, kind of. But then I was given introduction to the work of Sri Aurobindo, Indian sage, whose influence is by far exceeding a lot of the, let's say, surface level of understanding, because some of the polymaths of our time, likes of Ken Wilber, all rose on the work of the sage that I'm speaking about, because Sri Aurobindo laid out tremendous ground for separating the study known as Indology from the true value within its own oikumene, within its own oecumenic tradition of India, of what this sacred text represent. So as to begin that process of reclaiming the knowledge so-called gained by the outsiders into the tradition, which required a re-evaluation for generation of scholars, finally towards the end of the 20th century, where we have then the so-called perspective from inside. And we had a pleiad of scholars who went to India to live, study, and understand this tradition, whilst being with the exemplars of that tradition which it requires, rather than in comfort of their armchairs and their libraries in Oxfords and Harvards and what have you, or Zurichs and Sorbonnes. So it took quite a while until these processes took place. But when I went through the course, very similar things began to happen to me, and I was made there and then comfortable about it, because a lot of others were displaying that, so it seemed like it was desirable. So nobody would put, a cap on it. Nobody would dissuade, let alone prevent, us from going with the process. We were encouraged, in fact, loosen up, let go. In fact, the opposite approach was given. Those who were a bit too stiff, too tight in the kind of sittings, and it would come on, let go, just okay, don't keep tight control over the, if the body wants to shake, or just loosen up. And so there was a very different approach. But of course, when the course was over, when I went back to London, that's when a bit kind of a strange metaphor, all hell broke loose, because indeed, because the whole thing was pouring out from all my pores.
Yeah.
It was like a real undoing of what I thought of myself. So I don't know, in your case, and of course I've been working with people now close to 20 years, working with people, certainly over 10 years in the public sphere, prior to that more privately. And I have met people from different walks of life and with different experiences, some of them who had these processes decades ago and then somehow went underground, with those who came from very prepared in fact, similar backgrounds to mine, with masters, the gurus in those very well-known figures of the second half of the 20th century, from big spiritual movements to people who just simply had this so-called collision with an infinite and were totally unaware of what's going on and like seeking some explanations and guidance.
Yeah.
And this is where the work really comprised of separating so that there is a clarity between where it is a fully blown, as I mentioned, Kundalini process, which basically comprises rewiring from that neurophysiological jargon of synapses, and often at the expense of laying down the notion of oneself full stop, where we literally skirt very closely, and in some cases, unfortunately, price is being derailed into the side of depersonalization and D of all kinds. So this is where this work is not all academic research. It's always walking on a line.
Yeah.
Because some people in whom, let's say, psychological container and psychological maturity is greater. And what it means, of course, is there is no real, truly definable parameters of that in Western psychology, to my understanding. Maybe it is, and I'm not aware of, but I haven't come across that. But there are terms and concepts that exist within Indian culture. It's that notion of the sense of self with the term Ahamkara. It's the tattva, it's the category of consciousness, which is inseparable from what we consider our mind, inseparable from the functioning of the higher quality of the mind as intellect. And there are Sanskrit terms for that, which comprises in itself the inner organ known as Antakarana. The inner organ is here of tremendous importance because it's spoken of as the conglomerate which makes higher mind and the lower mind, or as it is spoken of in these esoteric traditions of Tantra and Sufism as the heart, because it's the inner organ. So the Ahamkara, it's the sense of self. It's what checks the sense of self. But of course, it is the Ahamkara which is not just sense of egoity in a psychological sense of being more altruistic versus being more selfish. Although Ahamkara, of course, checks that as well. It has to.
But it's more. Yeah.
But yes, but it is a truly universal sense of I amness with regard and in relation to one's body. And then, of course, the work proceeds from there to actually understand what body is. And that's where the tremendous leap of understanding is required, because body would have to be released into what it is. It's an expression, coagulated expression of consciousness, where a certain vantage point is allowed, certain POV is given. So consciousness as Kundalini, or Kundalini as consciousness, is literally that membrane which defines the functioning of our sense of self in terms of aforementioned Ahamkara. So in those of us in whom Ahamkara is less developed are always more in danger of being derailed, and one doesn't even have to be in spiritual processes, although in a lot of cases that is the case. Because if there is emphasis and propensity on nobody's home, the world doesn't exist, all this is a phenomena. In fact, you are not who you are. You are not even here to begin with, these slogans of non-duality and new Advaita. And if this impresses someone in whom the sense of self hasn't fully ripened, right? In other words, the fruit plucked off the tree too soon, the repercussions are often not just undesirable, it could be consequentially disastrous.
Yeah.
Because the depersonalization could be to such degree that the person would be a hollow being for a while.
Yeah.
I don't want to go now into some real drastic examples of there are plenty, particularly in India. And I spoke about it at live programs, spoke about it. There are, I'm sure, recordings out there in our channel where I spoke about this in the cultural context of India itself, where, of course, this also applicable. So let's not end up with some kind of preconceived idea that when it comes to India, everything is spick and span. No, India is just in a big mess as the rest of the world. Just to give you a parallel example, it used to be known as a Qigong phenomena, late 90s, early 2000. There was this phenomena of Qigong. When Qigong started to get popular in China, a whole wave of these awakenings took place en masse. I mean, we're talking about China now. We're talking about stadiums of people doing Qigong in sync. We're talking about people in parks doing it on street, hundreds of them, if not thousands. And at that very same time, China was swept by this, at the time, inexplicable, unexplainable wave of awakenings where people were shaking on the floor, behaving literally as if possessed, as if being as if with some epileptic fits. And with all this, of course, what was driven underground during the years of cultural revolution, this knowledge was only available in the crevices of the culture. Of course, it's China, right? It's a very ancient space. Just like India, of course, you cannot eradicate that what was zealously attempted to be eradicated, right? At some point. People started to rediscover their own tradition. So that I do remember that very well. This is just on the verge when all of us, Generation X, started buying computers, right? Because I'm 59 and I didn't get my first computer until I was like nearly in my 40s. Because there was no need for that, not in my profession, not in my life.
It's not that
Yes,
good.
it's the people who were it's fun. I had an email, but I didn't have computer. I would log in somewhere, and check
From the
online.
library or something.
Exactly, friend's house or whatever, like a library. But so, and around that very time, that whole, later when I entered and held my own blog for a number of years, I had my own blog on first on the grounds of Deepak Chopra's enterprise. It was run by his children at the time. And it was extraordinary how many people came up and started sharing. This we're talking about early 2000, 2003, 2004, sharing of their own journeys, and the people a lot from the Asia, from China, coming up with that whole Qigong phenomena. And I'm saying that the same in India. So, for example, a luminary who is considered by some of his followers to be an incarnation of the divine principle, the so-called avatar, Meher Baba was known, along with his, let's say, alma mater, he was also known for doing the first attempt at making a living a proper record of those who were totally derailed. And he would travel India several times, all throughout the perimeter, and working with these people known as musts, people who completely were thrown into the state of childhood development. Literally, like infancy sometimes. They eat and defecate in the same place. They don't know what to do. Their bodily movements are regressed completely. They're just like, and they're not even sannyasins. You know, that's what people don't understand. They're not sannyasins in the culture where sannyas is supported, where sannyasin proudly goes around because he is part of that culture, where he would be given a bowl of dal and rice in any village because that's their duty to support that way of life. Musts were considered to be on par with the outcast.
Yeah.
They were just like nuisance.
Yeah.
Nobody would really want to do anything about it. And he traveled India, worked with these people. His team was leaving the exact, precise record of, you know. And of course, I don't know where it is now, but because India is a culture where renunciation is a big way of life, where the approach is also the philosophies and some more extreme takes on certain philosophical axioms and philosophical perspectives are quite unapologetically radical, right? When the concept of this world simply doesn't exist. It's a dream, and maybe even more dream within a dream. So if it is impressing some young head of a very malleable a being who has very, very vague idea and not developed psychologically, it would just throw them into the stages of complete regression. Unfortunately, I did not come to such extreme cases in the West, not yet, and I hope it's not going to be the case. But I did come across people who have been suffering quite severe stages of depersonalization, either at some point or at the time when these encounters took place. And of course, the painstaking process of recovery begins there and then. And first, one would need to rescue them from that self-imposed, due to the neuroplasticity of the brain, notion of this, let's say, vacuumous, void-like state. You see? This is not to criticize the tradition or traditional approaches, but the applicability of that in our day and age, in our societal, let's say, way of life, in terms of what really is applicable and what should be considered to be as maybe not appropriate.
Yeah.
So going back to that, let's say, when I have gone through that intensity of the process, I've suffered similar fate of being misunderstood, even by local representatives of the organization who did not know how to deal with me and they did not know what to advise. So in some cases, I had to even resign from idea of doing group programs, which apparently I was legitimate because I took that course, and that would give me the license to join these programs where men would gather, women would gather, on these mattresses and all this yogic flying. Yogic flying is a kind of like it's a term, right? Where the hopping, known as in the TMCD program. So I couldn't do the programs because the display in my case was way out there, way too tumultuous. And so, I was even at some point, there were attempts to restrain me because someone lost their cool and just jumped on me and tried to help me. It was like all resulted in quite
Tried to get a
dramatic
straight jacket on
outcomes.
you or something.
Yeah, that energy was so powerful. Then that person held me, and then it just like pushed him, I don't know, 10 meters flying away, and and because like you can't contain that energy. That energy is the cosmic energy of creation.
It would
So
summon more nervous force than your nervous system could normally generate. It would
exactly,
be if
exactly,
like a weight lifting metaphor, you'd be able to lift
yeah,
twice your one rep max when that's. So I
exactly.
don't doubt. Yeah.
So in fact, it's like the attempts at containing that energy could be immediately there and then proportionate to how much energy would be generated to break that. So this is where the understanding that, like in the cases of going with something, whether you are in a stream of a fast running river, going with waves where the waves have their say more than one can argue with, is the approach. So going with the process is very often and remarkably and extraordinarily where the appeasement is congruent to the capacity within oneself to the surrender. At the same time, of course, I don't want to make this potentially misunderstood analogies and comments that in some cases people do need to redress immediately the whole setup of their lives, because this is where the payout could be very dramatic, because we cannot separate here what happens at the pranic level and how this physiology is sustained in terms of nourishment, routine, ways of life, and everything it requires, often radical realignment and reorganization, because otherwise it will be that 2 step forwards, 2 step back, or step forward, 2 back, which is also quite common. When people think that they don't need to change anything in their lives, that the process itself is intelligent enough and sophisticated enough, and there are opposite cases of that, where bizarrely people who have been, let's say, trained in a certain tradition had great discipline accompanied by facilitating what, almost expecting this, right? But when it happens, the psychic material began to be thrown out of the system along with all its tendencies. And I have witnessed when those so-called should know better then go in the opposite direction and begin to abuse their body. Because touching, let's say, experiencing, let's say, consciousness to whatever degree at the depth which gives one, let's say, this a visceral sense of one's essence. It doesn't mean that one is integrated in that state, but one, let's say, beholds that one's essence is light, light and sound, eternity, right? It's not confined to comings and goings of this body. Then why am I to put any restraints? What am I to hold on to? What am I, prefer or not to, right? That kind of like begin to spin itself out, and tendencies are given in no time, whether these tendencies to go and just on anything that, let's say, prior to that was considered to be as a formidable fruit, giving into tendencies of consciousness-altering substances, alcohol,
hedonic abandon, sort of out of balance,
sexual activity, like all that. And suddenly you could see how that derails the person. And because that's where the marriage here, that the connection, that the neurophysiology here has to catch up always. It has to always catch up. It's always lagging behind. Maybe now day and age, we can speculate our predecessors, our ancestors lived, I suspect, in much greater degree of what would connect us there and then and made us at the mercy, but at the same time intimately in tune with our environment. As we were pushing that, let's say, boundary and that gap between the environment and like cozy, comfortable ways of life, in terms of we can not feed ourselves 3 times a day, we can sleep in conditions where we're not affected, right? So this kind of like safety created that cultural way of life where we eat when we're not hungry, when we eat whatever that is, we don't even know if it's food, right? When we live life in a way that we think, well, it's up to me. Whereas our maybe ancestors had to live life in such a way that also would embed them with much greater energy, life force.
Yeah.
See, like I mean, these accounts how people would ride a horse, not just for a couple of hours, but like literally, if you need to be somewhere, you like literally almost sleep on a horse,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
How can that be done? I mean, these are not invented stories; these are facts, documented facts. People slept under the open skies. People ate one meal in 3 days. Like I'm not saying that people, you have to have fluids and liquids and drink, but there are these accounts of what today almost inconceivable for a modern man.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but when this pranic activity begins, let alone the Kundalini process, then it's as it were, certain things get thrown into realignment, which is on par with the cosmic realignment. And this is where, let's say, making or breaking begins.
Yeah.
So intelligence here, of course, hopefully that awakening also facilitates a greater degree of intuition.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm hearing what you're saying there, and that because it is a sort of a rewilding process, and so in an unnatural environment such as the modern world, you could see how people could get out of check with that when previously the natural environment and the sort of more tight social order would have kept people constrained within the bounds of material reality. Now you can sort of drift off into some sort of, end up in some 24/7 night in a city somewhere or whatever, and it's a space where, with that unchecked wilding regrounding back into the bodily experience and the animal life that we're bestowed with, you know what I mean? You could see that being a bit a sort of a difficult process, at least as it unfolds, sort of piece by piece. But some of the other things you were saying before really connected a few interesting dots for me as well, in terms of some of the darker sides of some of these processes. And I've interfaced with that in reference to psychedelics, you know what I mean? And in comparison to now having experienced this and having experienced that in the past, psychedelics seem like a bit of a blunt instrument in terms of it was a thrusting forward at the deepest levels into an ecstatic, very deeply present space. But upon return, that membrane, that organ that you're talking about, it didn't reform exactly in the same way. You know what I mean? And so I felt that I had these deep psychedelic experiences, and then I would come back and sort of feel like my consciousness was sort of on a bit crooked or whatever. You know what I mean? And it would feel like that that I had no way of conceptualizing it with the ways that you're saying now, but that is a really good way of framing it. It felt there was experiences of depersonalizations and derealizations, and not after unpleasant experiences. You know what I mean? After an experiences of what felt like a try before you buy sort of enlightenment, and then coming back and just being like, almost feeling like you were behind a few layers of bulletproof glass. You know what I mean? So experience was there, but you were removed from it in some capacity. And there's obviously no framework like that in the modern context, but I haven't experienced it now, but I have experienced it more so then, you know what I mean? And it was a process of only time seemed to reorder that relationship a little bit, you know what I mean? And reconfigured it in a way that alleviated the worst of it, you know what I mean? But throughout this process, it's been more of a grounded and an embodied sort of experience for me. But I could definitely see that potential, and so I think it's really interesting. Another thing that came to mind on that vein was I think it was Ramana Maharshi. I might have heard of his story of he was quite a young. I think that I've got the name right there, and he was quite a young fellow when it happened to him, and he had that experience of sort of surrendering to his own death on the floor. And at certain parts throughout his process, he would sit and get sores, you know what I mean? And people would tend to him, and he was, so that's, if that's not depersonalization, what is? So I can see what you're saying, and that there is a serious side to this path in terms of you are altering the fundamental mechanics of consciousness. And there's I speak about it very ineloquently, given I don't have a lot of those Eastern platforms of understanding, and those sound like, as you're saying that stuff, that just jumps out to me as those are the sorts of metaphors and terms that I'm looking for when I talk about these processes. You know what I mean? And in the West, we have sort of crazy, not crazy, or you've got this or you've got that, and if it's not in the DSM, or it's a you're on your own sort of thing. But there is a rich world in there that I've felt many different experiences throughout my experience of life, where there is states where it's like, I just had the most beautiful experience that I've ever had, and now I feel the worst that I ever have in a strange way. You know what I mean? And so there's not a rich language in order to articulate the nuance of these states. And I may have been rolling the dice there in a way that maybe I'm lucky to have got off relatively lightly in that sense. You know what I mean? But I don't doubt the reality of what you're saying there. And in India, where they have a rich heritage and tradition of these sorts of things, that absolutely doesn't startle me at all, that there's a certain percentage of what are casualties that you encounter in a Western context as well, in a variety of different things, but casualties in terms of along the path, there's crevices and cracks that can open up, that if you fall into and then get locked in on that process, and that becomes your new operating system, I could see that being people being in what seem like inescapable sort of hells in that place. You know what I mean? But it does seem like there is a way of conceptualizing and understanding and navigating it with some sort of poise and grace, but it wouldn't at all be intuitive. And it's interesting why you wouldn't see that as much in the West versus the East, whether it's that early exposure where we sort of have a little bit of we don't get people exposing a lot to deep meditative practices or necessarily even really psychedelics and things like that until people are a bit older and maybe have a bit more development there, to not really regress the whole way back to an infantile sort of state. But people definitely do fall into cracks within that with the spiritual context and the modalities that are available now. And there's all sorts of weird spaces where people tap out of the path that they were on and then medicalize themselves. And a lot of those people, it seems like, really don't get better. You know what I mean? They go from, I had these bunch of experiences, to now I've got this condition and I'm going to take these pills and I'm never going anywhere near anything that's going to open me up again. You know what I mean? And that's, I think, the big danger in the West of stalling on the path in one of these sort of states that they don't have any capacity to understand, and then just jettisoning the spiritual path and getting on a medical path, which won't lead to any actual resolution. You know what I mean? And so I think that's a risk, a real risk, that I think it's great that you do speak about that. And I think it does interface with a lot of this work being done with psychedelics and stuff like that, that people who are experienced with those modalities, they see a lot of these studies going on, and it's like, yeah, but there is some weird stuff in there. You know what I mean? There is some weird potentials, and you do have to be careful. It's not just all this is going to cure your depression. There is an element of, only you and people that have this more developed understanding of these things, and those metaphors and those analogies and that whole body of understanding, you do need that at a certain point almost, it seems, if you get into a really tight spot here. You know what I mean? And if you're not willing to, that's what I've always said to people about psychedelics. If you're not willing to really roll the dice with your experience here, these probably aren't things that are worth playing with. You know what I mean? Because you are playing with stuff that you don't understand. You know what I mean? And even there would be gaps, I assume, in that Eastern way of understanding, where it's they've got ways of dealing with it, but to say they have a comprehensive understanding of exactly what's going to happen and what might happen to any one individual might be a bit of a stretch. You know what I mean? So that's there's some stuff that jumped to mind from what you were saying there. I think it was really important, and it was filling in a few blanks for me in terms of how those things interrelated, and I understand a bit better now, I think, some of my own experiences.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This, I mean, just to touch up on what you have reflected back as your own, let's say, observations. Well, speaking of the psychedelics, let's take ayahuasca, which has been popularized to the level of industry now, and there are people who swear by it, and people who literally, well, promote it zealously, even if they are not necessarily themselves part of that industry, but just as on the receiving end, as customers, so to speak.
Yep.
And I see here this separation. Also, there are a lot of people who are deeply resonant with the work I do. But what's interesting, soon as it comes to me speaking about the, let's say, distinction between consciousness facilitating processes, consciousness-based processes, and consciousness altering substances to facilitate, let's say, fundamental changes, transformations in consciousness. This is where people immediately like, okay, you are right here, but you are totally missing it, man. You know, like there's almost this strong denial of looking into this, and even looking into this based on the body of evidence, which is plenty out there. I mean, I've met people, have spoken to people, worked with people, and some of these people confirm that you can have 25 extraordinary ayahuasca ceremonies, and a 26th one, hole is blown in one's auric field, using that New Age language, and then the whole, literally, one's whole being and psyche is exposed to all external influences, and it's painstaking process to repair that.
Mm-hmm.
So the cases of people coming up now more and more and speak up in terms of what this really entails. But it's industry, so let's not forget, it's industry, and it's driven by demand and supply.
Mm-hmm.
And that demand and supply, of course, here, I personally see is also linked intimately to the way Western mentality functions. And what is Western mentality? Western mentality is cherry picking. It likes to take what it finds useful, discard the rest, which sometimes can be really a good approach, right? Kind of this more utilitarian approach. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it's like, well, let's not get lost in the jungle. Let's just get straight to the core of why we're here, cut to the chase. At the same time, when it comes to the intricacy of these processes, I find again and again how it backfires, or how it doesn't really deliver, when the approach here is to simply go shortest cut to what otherwise would require some work. So if there is this, one is required to really roll up one's sleeves and dedicate a considerable amount of time to what would be considered here as acquiring knowledge, sticking with certain discipline, and working on oneself, whereas one can have the possibility of shortcut through some, let's say, being trampolined into the astral realm, where one, as it were, given promise that one's traumas, traces of shadow traces, all this what spoken of today a lot in modern circles, spiritual circles, that is, then why wouldn't I do that? Why do I have to go with all that traditional, quite frankly, long route? I just want to cut through, leapfrog myself out of all that predicament. Of course, it offers that what in our day and age is known as that mentality. If you have the means, you go to the marketplace and you choose what's to your liking, right? If I have the means, I want to drive the best car. It doesn't have to be the most show-off car, let's say, but I have the means, I want to drive real good car. I want to drive the best vehicle. Show me, okay? That's what I'm not gonna settle for less. If I'm equipping my, let's say, studio, my house, my whatever, I want to go for the best if I have the means. So that factor plays in tremendously, and people don't realize how much it plays in that the industry of psychedelics. And let's distinguish that. I'm not talking about drugs and all that, like, let's say, addictions that people form, which is a huge topic here. Addictions even to painkillers, because that's all the term drug here. The territory is blurred. Because you mentioned that earlier as well, that a lot of people resort to suppressants because they don't want to deal with what suddenly being reared its ugly face. They don't want to deal with the symptomatology, which maybe disrupts the otherwise perhaps neat or demanding way of life, right? They prefer that. And that is, again, part of the way our life is run by. Right? Shortcut. Give me okay, I can't deal with that now. Give me that right pill, okay? Okay, so comfortably numb, right? That Pink Floyd classic. I want to just get on with the job, with the day, with responsibilities. And I understand, sympathize, and I know how it is. I've been there myself. I know sometimes pill seems to be the only option, for the householder, father, mother, responsibilities, this, that, job, paying the bills, squaring it all. Sometimes it's like, let me get through the day. But when this is turned into a system, or when it driven by sheer, let's say, inertia of not wanting to go where one's evolution is urging one to go, then it's only a matter of time, because this sweeping under the rug is not going to be it's not. There will be a time of very, very often painful waking up and smelling the coffee, because when we speak about this particular, let's say, unfoldment, you can only sweep consciousness under the rug, because I'm using that now consciously, to a point when it will erupt, when it will combust, when it will begin to tear the very fabric of one's existence. Because this, unless one would be willing to settle on living the life of a vegetable, because that's also possible. One can vegetate the system. One can literally suppress the system to such degree, numb the system, that it will become ineffective in a way, numb to a degree that it cannot function. But going back to the psychedelics, this is the still dividing line of where some people willing or not willing to go. And yes, I keep speaking about it, and what also always reassuring and encouraging, of course, not that I need to have encouragement and reassurance into what I understand, experienced, and know very well, but the peers in the field out there, across the cultures, allow the same cause. They speak to the same importance of distinguishing between consciousness altering substances, right, that quit cut to nirvana, so to speak, versus what happens when we apply methodologies of consciousness. And of course, those proponents of the psychedelics will say, well, psychedelics themselves are also methodologies of consciousness. And they're right. they are, but they are assisting agents, never means in themselves to take us to the goal. Because, as you have rightly observed, we are always thrown back to the body in its states, no matter how fantastic and extraordinary the ride was. Whereas with gradual transformation, which is alchemy, our body catching up, our neurophysiology, our psyche, our synaptic responses, all is encompassed in that all-embracing process. So even maybe the progress may be slower, but somehow we can sleep well, reassured that it happens in a coherent, all-encompassing, harmonious manner, rather than being kind of, given very high, followed by, out of necessity, lows. That's what this is also very well known. And going back quickly to the example, which I think was very, very fitting of Ramana Maharshi, you're absolutely right. His example is classical, but often somehow misplayed or underplayed, that his awakening at the age of 16 was precisely that, let's say, equipped with this inner resolve, that inner wisdom and courage to follow it all through. So being under that impact of depressive thoughts, of mortality of the body, and laying down and, okay, well, let's see what it is like. If I'm about to die, let me die. And this facilitated this tremendous, profound awakening. He was still in the phases of that continued development of that psyche, of that ahamkaric development. And we know that he was incapacitated for a number of years, eventually having to retreat into the cave and continued long years of his sadhana when he was completely and utterly supported by his family. His brother would carry the food cooked by his mother sometimes would, and all this being underplayed, somehow castrated out of the story, because he was canonized, he is canonized in the tradition of New Advaita in the West, in India as well, but in the West in particular. And that canonization is not helpful, because he is actually an example of how long, painstaking, painful, and uncertain the process itself. And yet he was supported by the culture he was born into. So him adopting, let's say, as his day job, teaching Advaita Vedanta, is something else, is a day job. He was given an ashram, he was installed in that position and was venerated as a sage that he was. This is not to undermine to an iota of his influence and importance. But if we are to speak openly about these early years and the phases, I would say this would be almost inapplicable in our day and age for that aforementioned by us average Joe, unless he has that same setup that Ramana had.
Yeah, and that could easily end up with the situation falling through the cracks, as you said. That term that you said before, for the people in India that are the sort of the casualties of that process.
Yes.
I don't
Yeah,
think you have to. Yeah, I don't think you have to configure things too differently around to easily see a character like Ramana, and probably a lot of other characters that may have had that sort of a potential, if given that platform, end up in those cracks, and maybe lost forever in those cracks, because it's someone has to be navigating in their body and integrating and navigating the space in an elegant way in order to get the food to feed themselves and Ramana. You know what I mean? And then so it's someone has to be carrying that torch, and if not seeing that potential in him, then just caring for him out of love. And you know what I mean? As you're saying, in a modern context, this could easily be someone that you find institutionalized. You know what I mean? There could have been a few Ramana type potentials in the West that are just in a straitjacket somewhere.
I've witnessed this, how family members facilitate hospitalizations, of checking people into asylums. That's what they are.
Yeah.
Out of love, because that's their definition, that's their understanding.
Yep.
You see?
Yep. That's the
And
only
they
that's the
followed
only
what
capacity
they
they
consider
have.
to be the best. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And so that's a very real situation along this path. So yeah, I think it pays to anything that can be done to create a sort of a more of an awareness and a framework around this. And I think that you're even someone being who, I've had incredible experiences under the influence of psychedelics, but the things that you're saying don't at all strike me as out there, or I think that the developing this process throughout the body and then creating a vessel slowly over time, as you're talking about, through this rewiring and the mind body, the pranic field, it's all there's several moving parts in there, but as that container becomes more sort of receptive and a better platform for, I think consciousness, it all has to change. You know what I mean? That there's multiple, but that's the stable way of doing it. Versus a psychedelic experience very much feels like a glimpse, and it's a disembodied glimpse, and then that consciousness, all of that energy and that momentum has to return back to a constricted and undeveloped vessel, and then as you're saying. It wouldn't strike me at all impossible that it could blow a hole in something, and I've probably had a few holes blown in me, and it's definitely a more chaotic and blunt instrument for this process, having sort of had a toe in both sides of things. You know what I mean? It definitely feels that way. And so that maybe brings us to a point that I'm really curious about in terms of, with your retreat setting and stuff like that, do you work with people that are on this continuum, or is this an experience where you're able to actually catalyze these sorts of awakenings in just an average Joe, say? You know what I mean? If do you have a place where you can create a container where that just blossoms, or do you work with the people who it has already come to the surface with? Like, how do you navigate that space? Like, because there is a really interesting element that shows up in a lot of these stories of the East that I didn't pay too much attention to before this, but now it's like, people report being around people like of these non-dual sort of traditions, Advaita and stuff like that. Punjaji is one of the ones that shows up some of the times, where people were in his presence and became not necessarily so much in the body, but really like almost like psychedelic like glimpses into the non-dual sort of truth of existence. And so all of that ties in. I'll just throw that over to you in the sense of, how do you think that ties in? Is that what you're trying to do? Is that completely off the mark with what you do? And how do you think that it relates in terms of glimpsing with a non-dual glimpse of a sort of a greater reality, a more true perception of how consciousness and the world relate, versus the embodied, gradual but embodied process of awakening in the body, and with the movements and the sounds and all of that? How does all of that fit together for you, and what you do when if you were to take 10 average Joes and, you know what I mean, that sort of retreat process and all of that? I'll just lob that ball of nonsense over to you and see if you can make some sense of it.
Yes. No, yes. Well, everything. So what I mean by that is, the work here doesn't follow some kind of tight outlined protocol, and it doesn't really, that's the really the uniqueness of this particular work, that it arises in response to, and arising in response to is a very important aspect here, because it needs to be able to facilitate anything that someone requires in any particular moment in time on their journey. And that may include someone who already had, let's say, these encounters with the infinite, someone who had some of this, let's say, activation. And as I mentioned, some of this activation may take place many years ago, and then it all goes underground. or these activations resulted in a whole host of chronic conditions. Or someone who has just freshly, let's say, like out of the blue, just bloomed out and seeking some guidance, reassurance. So the containers, by large, are quite mixed. We don't have the luxury, as it were, yet. We don't have our center. We are working on this. This year heralds us going out fully to, effectively speaking, work towards manifesting that. But at the moment, as we are traveling and offering our programs in few principal sites, which we warmed up and formed beautiful relationships over the years, namely in Europe, it's Germany, Poland, and sometimes here in Spain, in Mallorca. We go to the States, but in recent years, mostly to Mexico for the North Americans. So these containers are mixed, made of mixed crowd. In other words, there are old-timers, people who continue their work, and they are like, let's say, come to these programs on a regular basis. And there are always newcomers, and these newcomers can come from different walks of life in terms of what they look for on their journey. And that acknowledgement there, right, it's all based on intuitional assessment, based on also years of experience with people. Sometimes someone may come up with what they want, but it needs to be assessed there very clearly to see where they are in that process. There are a lot of young people started to come up, to our surprise, in the last 5 years. Prior to that, I used to joke, I used to find myself being youngest in the room in the earlier years. In the last few years, like let's say about 5 to 6 years, we have a lot more young people coming in. So the proportion, the ratio. So a lot of these young people either dubbed with spiritual practices, some of them come from a very disciplined background, often yoga or non-duality circles, right? They're dedicated, very serious about this, and they want to experience that. So the assessment is at what capacity they are to facilitate that further. And with all that being said, there is also a creation of the field which is greater than the sum total of the parts. And it's not even something that I am here, let's say, in control of. I'm using that term, in control of, or in charge, but rather working with. That perhaps the most extraordinary part, where the amplification of the process, of course, is self-evident. And the work here comprises of helping the facilitation of activation of prana, whether this is in early phases, intermediate phases, because it has therapeutic benefits. It has therapeutic benefits because it prepares the ground. If one is to awaken in this life, then one is much better off, and this is traditionally and clinically speaking of, that one went through the process of pranatana. Because that's what creates all that what is Kundalini known for. Anyway, they're very analogous and very, very close in their display. The only difference, of course, here is that pranatana, it's a working on all these levels without necessarily changing the fundamental identity shift. Doesn't happen unless Kundalini is awakened. Intellectual understanding, spiritual insights can be plenty. So that's what we do facilitate. And people who come, let's say, completely unaware of this or haven't experienced any of that, very often, very quickly, get plugged into that field and begin to display this there and then. In some cases, it's just extraordinary. So, they're very, very receptive. With others, it's less so. But I would say that our programs so far quite compact. The container itself is made of 30 to 50 people. So they are not large containers. Also, this is topped by the facilities and the venues that we work in.
Yeah.
So if there is an exponential leap, we need larger facilities. And this year, I'm going to launch first master training program, because we would need to have more facilitators. You see, because this in the programs, in our settings, if I worked as a teacher, I would have 1 or 2 facilitators with me in a group of 30 plus people. But if, let's say, we are 60 people, let alone 100, then I would need to have the number of facilitators tripled. You see?
Yeah.
Because it requires the work. Sometimes you need to offer guidance to someone, very often to this person, and they will receive more attention than the rest of the group, simply because they are requiring more attention. So let's say out of the 40 people attended, right, you would give attention to 5 people, simply because they are the most in need of that attention, whilst the rest of the group, as it were, goes with that flow.
Yeah.
Interestingly, and I do kind of find it also fascinating that these mixed groups have their unique quality, because it's like, maybe in any setting, when you go somewhere and you're surrounded by more seasoned practitioners, whatever that is, right? Like like musical circles, like any creative enterprise, learning something, you learn faster. There is greater reassurance, there's a greater comradeship, there's greater companionship, because you are in the company of more experienced people. In sports, any analogy here is welcomed. We also had programs, and we still offer them, very short ones for complete newcomers. You see, to test and try this work. Let's say day long, 2-day long, or weekend long, Friday to Sunday, or whatever the time frame allows. Like, we call them city programs.
Yeah.
Because they usually take place in the cities for convenience. They are usually non-residential, whereas our long programs, like 5 to 10-day long programs, all of them are residential. All of them somewhere in a facility which is conducive for that. So I do like working in these mixed containers, made of people from different, let's say, levels of experiences, simply because it facilitates work faster. It's as simple as that. The field gets amplified quicker, and that quickening happens there for everyone involved.
Yeah.
So it's like the breakthroughs are there plenty. So, like, I would say that it's not at all an exaggeration, and I would be held accountable by those who will hear that, who know this work, that in our programs, 90% of complete involvement in terms of the display. And I would say 98% of the energetic response, even if people don't display that, they still give feedback of what happens to them in their field, even if there is not obvious, let's say, display of the amplification of the movement of prana. So the mere fact that they are in that container, in that setting, already creates different qualities. The absorption, right? The kind of touching that bliss sheet, that kind of the sense, like a release of trauma, release of this psychic material, all is there.
Yeah.
But other than that, like people who came to our programs, they were always astonished to the sheer display, the display of how varied that is. It's not like our programs have certain absolute 100% must requisites. Our floor is soft, covered. Yoga mats, special mattresses, white sheets. Then there are only yoga mat surfaces covered. Some people sitting, other people having standing process because their process is on their feet. Some people rolling, others hopping. Some people in mudras, some people are vocalizing. So the whole thing is like this ancient theater. It's not your average zazen setting where everyone sits in line and doesn't move. Nor is it just like a yoga retreat where, no, it's like sometimes for the newcomer, it can feel overwhelming. Sometimes very often it feels, I don't want to kind of like hide this and pretend, and make people like pull the wool over their eyes. This is not the kind of immersion one goes to just to sit there, twiddle their thumb, have lunch, come back. No, these are energetically full-on transformative programs. So when people come to them, they come to them for that. So they do their groundwork, they research us, they look into that. Sometimes they follow this work online for years before committing to what we call immersion. And I prefer that way. You see, because sometimes when people end up casually in our programs, then it necessitates a lot of cajoling, preparing, and yes, at times people drop out. There is always this chance that someone will, well, that's not for me. Well, we shake our hands and bid each other goodbye till next time or perhaps next life. But that's how it works, So because these programs are, they can be very demanding, intense, but they're always, always deeply fulfilling. And that's what the rapport and the feedback and what gives us reassurance to carry on in that format rather than start tidying it up or creating some restrictions so as to maybe kind of like, keeping tap on. I've tried this, trust me. Over the years, I've tried different approaches and I've realized that it's with the container, it's the same attitude that individual goes through. Anything that you try to restrain, bound to backfire or bound to explode. Or one would have to suppress that. And we know that suppressing results in every repression results in some kind of demorphing, some kind of what's the right term? Well, anomaly, right?
Yeah.
Individually or culturally, right? Individually or collectively. Whatever we suppress will begin to express itself in an ugly way.
Yeah.
It will find its way through back into the light. It will find this is the way of consciousness. So suppression leads to repression. Suppression leads to anomaly. So leads to illness, disease, and then disease itself. It's a desperate attempt to heal itself. So that's also what our culture is. That individual process here can be transferred and superimposed on culture at large.
Yeah. I think that touches back on, what we were getting at the start of the conversation, being those diseases of despair and the fact that you do see this process arising all throughout history. It almost sticks out to me as it's almost like the collective's way as a collective, a certain percentage of the people, just in the same way that having people that are politically oriented to the left and the right eventually comes together to make a half sane whole. You know what I mean? And so in that same way, you need a certain percentage. Even all the basic, more primitive and earlier cultures, not even primitive is the right word, but prehistoric cultures and everything, they had more of a relationship with the divine, and they had dedicated shamans and places to express this sort of as a group of 10 to 50 or whatever that number is, there needed to be a certain percentage of more communication with the sacred and a way of existing that honors the journey of life and all of that. And that was something that they held integral, you know what I mean? And sometimes it was a relationship with ways of altering their consciousness with the surroundings and things like that. But it strikes me as that is something about the process that's going, and really interesting the things that you hit on there with the Qigong. I heard about that and how they culturally had to suppress that in China because they didn't like to see people waking up and all of that sort of thing. It may be that a certain percentage of the body, of the total body, you know, because it's all fractal here. Inside of ourselves is somehow the whole universe, and inside of the larger, every larger system contains the smaller and the larger within it. You know what I mean? It's some sort of a nested, interrelated fluidity when it's seen for what it truly is, the thing that we're embedded in here. And the expression of that seems to sort of, it calls upon individual cells to wake up to a new function almost. You know what I mean? Of within the system, there needs to be a certain amount of this that comes through. And you know what I mean? I would have never been able to conceptualize something like that prior to being thrust into a relationship with it. But you know, from where I'm sitting now and you know, the things that you're saying, and that's sort of where it puts my head in terms of, because it is something that you've seen bubbling up and all throughout culture and history. And there's no doubt in my mind, having now experienced this, that demonic possession, witchcraft, voodoo, all sorts of things that would have been given all these labels across time were the burgeoning up of something through this non-physical, energetic, nervous field of experience that is real. You know what I mean? And to a lot of people listening, you know, and some of my audience there, that may sound ridiculous, but there's no other way of, you know, to say any less would be bullshitting you. You know what I mean? And so it's as hard as it is to frame and to speak and to hear with the left brain, something more on that right brain, intuitive, heart, body connected side understands that there is an expression of something here. And I do believe it is something very vital and important that you're working with, and something sacred. I don't know exactly how else to frame it, you know, within my limited conception there, but it is important. And I think that unapologetic space that you've created there for it is a really unique and beautiful container for that. Having come from someone who had this come out in another context, it was incredibly unpleasant to have it thrust on me in a setting where it was like, you're breaking the rules, you're being a jerk, like everyone else is still, don't you see? Like, what are you doing? Like, we're you know what I mean? That container is so abrasive, and I think some people probably would have tried to cram a lid on it, and then maybe it does just bubble down and turn into some sort of condition or something. You know, it had to go somewhere, and I don't think it'd be good to not let it do what it wants to do. And so I think that's a beautiful container, and I don't doubt that there would be some greater than a sum of its parts energy going on there from having experienced it from inside of one thing. The way that the energy uses the environment and the stuff around it, there's an environmental awareness in there that's really inexplicable. Like when it first was thrust on me, I was in a tiny little dormitory room at a Vipassana retreat, and it was like coiling around the bed and then grabbing the windowsill, and you know, so I could see that in a space where it was you know, resonating and being allowed to do what it wants to do. I don't doubt that, you know, that you could roll over into someone else and do a two-person, you know what I mean? Like anything would be on the cards in terms of how it would utilize that. And I feel like I've never really, I created a space in my home, not the place where I am now, but my home near to here, and where it's padded ground and where I can just let things roll. And I feel like that, having a place like that, and so it's really good to hear that you've created a space where it's a container where it can be whatever it wants to be there, you know, standing, sitting, yoga postures, whatever. That to me jumps out as the perfect environment to foster this sort of thing. So, you know, I would say that if anyone's skeptical about this, but interested, Igor's retreats would probably be a fantastic place to jump off and enter into the space, because it is real, whether however you want to frame that, unfortunately or fortunately, but it is something real and something beautiful and something sacred. And I don't doubt, I haven't seen any of a container that looks nearly as good as what you've created there. And I have seen a couple of the clips of the singing and the vocalizing, and it immediately feels like what that energy feels like to see that. You know what I mean? It's almost an ecstasy of being, for lack of better words. You know what I mean? It's a full unfoldment of what that process wants to do, and I think it's a really beautiful thing. The last thing that I was sort of curious about, Igor, was in relationship to trauma and the release of energy. From my perspective, it seems really geared towards releasing, like untangling itself. Almost like I envision it almost like, how you have a rubber band ball. It almost feels like there's a rubber band ball made around my spine almost, or around my body, that it knows how to untangle itself because it knows how it got tangled, but on a deep level that I'm not cognizant of. You know what I mean? So it was the experience like for you and for those that you've seen, really a lot on that quite difficult releases and then cathartic releases, like releases of blockages or energy or constrictions? Or was I just super neurotic and bound up, and so this part of it feels very, surface level, like full front for me? Or is that intrinsic to the process? Like, do you conceptualize that process as a disentanglement and as a releasing and an unfolding? Like, it really feels distinctly to me like there's a unique character to it, and then a surrender, and then, yep, you got it. And then it moves on to somewhere else, and it's like, yep, you got it. And it's a letting go from the core for me, almost like I can feel where I think this goes back down to a basic sort of Buddhist aversion, almost like craving or aversion, and it's averse to the pain, and then or the negative, or the just tightening, and then there's a releasing into it that this process seems to love. You know what I mean? Like all of the poses and everything some of them seem about moving energy, but some of them, the majority, probably feel geared more towards, yep, this is it. And then if you're like try and muscle through that process, it's like you'd get nowhere. You hurt yourself or something. But it's like getting all the way to here, and then it's like, now can you relax? And then it's like, okay, and then that sort of, you're on it's a very delicate dance of surrender with it's hard to even articulate, but is that a characteristic of it that is more unique to my experience, do you think? Or is that inherent in, once people come to this, there's a lot of things that need to be untwisted, if you know what I mean?
Well, if you are asking if the bodily movements, contortions, right,
Yep.
and extensions, knots, like releasing, like sensations, right? This it's all within the vocabulary of yoga, where yoga itself comes from. So it is very clear, and it is also very well known, that all existing yogic vocabulary comes from those who went through it spontaneously, and then they marked it down, recorded that, and left a rich body of work. It wasn't invented, like imagined.
Couldn't have
Or
been.
tried.
How did it end up in
No,
me?
exactly. It was
Yeah. Yep.
observed, and then put down as a potentially beneficial. I argue that the same happened in liturgy, both in East and West. The sacred singing, harmonizing, nasal throat singing, whatever culture we take. In Western Europe, liturgy of the early Christian communities, to me, almost certain was the byproduct and result of spontaneous unfoldment of spirit, of psyche, which then created this or that particular note, particular, let's say, combination of notes, sounds that then would become, let's say, called a song of a particular order. Likewise, of course, with all the physical symptomatology and display. So when the body moves in certain way, is because the body is moved by prana, and body moves simply following the pranic current. And some of these movements can feel very orchestrated, literally as if orchestrated by an invisible hand of a choreographer.
Yeah.
I'm never ceased to marvel to see how people perform dances, whether up on their feet or sitting. The movements are so precise, they're symmetrical. If they do something on one side, then they mirror that on the other side. But there are equally plenty of the examples when the movements are less photogenic, more chaotic, more like the body is contorting into different shapes, and that all is accompanied by prana going into, or facilitated by prana going into the areas where it needs to go to facilitate greater expansion. So what happened to you is not at all uncommon or heralding or signaling that something is wrong with you or something was wrong with you. It's a normal event. It's, in fact, the way the body restores, or through the body movements, the harmony is restored and the balance is brought back in. So when you speak about this, when you ask for the confirmation or simply for elucidation, how can that, what analogy can be given? The analogy can be given how one experiencing that, and you've done it pretty well with that, something knotted itself, right, and trying to unknot. I will give an analogy simply as a complementary one with regard to simple process of digestion, something we eat, right? Let's say we ate something and we have this uncomfortable time with digesting the food, and it is accompanied by colics, unpleasant, and the whole, the whole body is feeling being taxed, right? So maybe a burping will come, rise, and release that tension immediately, like that. Something, this pressure on the heart almost, on, from the diaphragm, very unpleasant. And suddenly this burp and release. This is why in the Orient, burping is a compliment to a chef. In Japanese culture, it's actually part of the table manners. You don't hold back out of politeness. Burp, and the chef knows the food is good, kind of like going around it that way. So why am I bringing that example? In both cases, in any case, it is the amount of metabolizing power which creates conditions where anything can be digested. So it's a fire element. Fire element here in encapsulated way, spoken of as spark of consciousness, that each and every one of us are lit by. So on the level of physiology, it's that digestive fire. It's that Agni, that Sanskrit term. It's that digestive fire. And the root cause of all health, as far as Ayurveda is concerned, part of the Vedic branches, is all down to the longevity and strength of one's digestive fire. So if one's digestive fire is good, one's health is good. So the applicational approaches are all geared at maintaining, sustaining that fire. So that on a mythological level is that fire brought down by Prometheus from the Olympus and given to people to civilize themselves, to become on par with gods, which caused him being cast down, right? So this analogy here is that, and that fire needs to be maintained. So that fire now, at the level of the psyche, at the physiological level, it's that digestive fire. It doesn't matter how sumptuous is the meal. If our digestive fire is poor, no enjoyment is there.
Yeah.
And the analogy here, spark of consciousness. So when consciousness is strong in us, is developed well, then all experiences can be digested, metabolized, and integrated into the fabric of our awareness. But if that somehow spark of consciousness is eclipsed, diminished, whatever, or conditions of that are such that something is constantly blowing from the so-called outside, something creates, too much dampness, too much agitation, then that spark of consciousness, as it were, doesn't have the capacity to digest experiences. So that indigestion from the food we eat here is indigestion at the level of capacity to metabolize experiences, which results in accumulation of stresses and ultimately what we speak of in relation to trauma.
Mm-hmm.
I bring that out repeatedly from place to place, from program to program. It's not the nature of experience, it's the capacity to metabolize that experience. And I give drastic examples. Someone can come out of the combat without PTSD, and someone can come out of the supermarket from the exchanges with the cashier, where one's nervous system was jolted, and one can accumulate stress.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the capacity of nervous system to vibrate to such degree where every experience, every impression is literally reabsorbed into the fabric of consciousness or awareness. When it is not, it would have to lay sediment in a system, because in a waking state of consciousness, it is by design, it has to be pushed to the subconscious or unconscious, because otherwise one would not be able to function.
Yeah.
So this is why when some experience happened, we kind of like left in the aftermath of that experience. We either have to process it or talk about it, right? Whatever happened, traffic accident, encounter at work, this, that, at home, with loved ones, with those strangers. That experience happened, and there is this time frame when that experience is being either externally talked about with someone next to us, or talked on a self-talk level, right?
Yeah. Yep.
We're not like robots. Experience happened, we walk out and carry on. This is psychopathy.
Yeah.
We are in the process of doing our best to integrate that experience. If experience is jolting, we may go about it for a while, and but by the end of the day, somehow the dust will settle, we'll feel better. If not, what happens is, because we cannot function, otherwise we would have to be in the presence of that experience for a prolonged period of time. It's in the nature of consciousness. In the waking consciousness, we have to be always open to next experience, So stress here is spoken of as a mechanics of pushing unmetabolized experience under what is then goes into the unconscious and subconscious. This is a Western language. In the Eastern tradition, in Indian tradition, this is spoken of as vasanas, impressions. Vasanas form a rich layer of samskaras. And this samskaras is, what effectively speaking is that samskaric field. So this vasanas, or another term, vikalpas, psychic impressions and psychic tendencies. Vasanas are psychic impressions, and vasanas are, did I say vasanas? Yeah, vasanas are psychic impressions, and vikalpas are mental tendencies.
Mm-hmm.
Our mental tendencies depend upon psychic impressions. So this relationship between vasanas, impressions, and vikalpas, tendencies, is like this. One feeds the other. That's what creates, in a more Western language, that gut-brain circuit of synaptic connections.
Mm-hmm.
So this is biological will of samsara at this level. right? So this, we could speak about samsaras, that kind of like a birth, rebirth, continued kind of existence. Or we can speak about it at the local level, that samsara here is, no? Synaptic connection, release of the hormones into the body, and the body functions under the impact of this compote of hormones, and that it's in itself creates the craving. Doesn't matter, positive, negative, it creates craving that would usher back that impulse back into the brain for a next dosage of this oh gosh, I just slipped out of my tongue. Hormones. So these hormones are then desired by the body to be re-experienced. So we get addicted to certain states. So this is why it's important, at least let's get addicted to states that are promoting, giving us the sense of life well lived, right? Let's promote and revel in the states that gives us sense of fullness, felicity, bliss, beatitude, right? Because we can and will be addicted to other states because that's the way of life. But you can see how some of us get addicted to anger, jealousy, frustration, all this kind of what is known in the gamut of negative experiences. Not that I'm saying that this to be denied, but to understand the mechanics makes one free, or at least the first steps towards freeing oneself from dependency on these states begins there and then. So that's this connection, of course, here is it's the stuff of spiritual approaches. And this is where really that ABC truly begins, so that we separate wheat from the chaff in terms of what is actually happening, why we act and react in a certain way, whereas we know that all this is consciousness, all this is ocean of being. Why can't we just feel happy-go-lucky all the time?
Yeah.
Well, because this is part and parcel of being subjected to this temporary limitation, that being in the body, experiencing it through this complex neurophysiology, comes at a price. So to set it off, in our day and age, comes spiritual methodology until, by hook or by crook, by whatever divine intervention, something announces itself or arrives unannounced and takes us by surprise and begins at work on our behalf. You could see it that way as well.
Yeah. What you're saying there really, really resonates with me in terms of, like, you're sort of saying that the soldier in the war and the what determines whether that soldier has PTSD is some sort of complex algorithm that's his innate sensitivity, his experience before then, his constitution at the time, how whether he was slept and fed at the there's all of those different things, but the process of it storing in the body almost as a kinetic energy storage, you know what I mean? From a really sort of a practical perspective, it's excess energy. We got to do something with it, you know what I mean? It's not appropriate to express it, in this rigid context that we have ourselves in culturally a lot of the time. So it's got to, we'll chuck it in his left shoulder, or we'll chuck it down here, or it's a storing of something that probably would be damaging if not put somewhere. You know what I mean? If this left to freely reign around or whatever. And a really peculiar thing I've noticed that you might sort of comment on is, since this process has happened, I've noticed that when I go through intense experiences, I'm, just to give some context, I'm someone who's really sensitive always. And, I'd watch a movie, even though I'd like to watch the movie and it would be good. By the end of the movie, I'm in the fetal position, sort of, I've absorbed a lot of the energy of that main character and it hasn't. But I've noticed that since I've had this process active in me, what will happen now is, as I'm consuming, I've watched movies and things like that, my body will move as it's watching the movie, and at the end of the movie, I'm not tense. The energy has actually danced through me in a way, and it was, it was really peculiar, because having the experience of it happen every time, if I watch a stressful show or a movie, it's going to have a big effect on me. You know what I mean? I'm going to be tense. probably not good for me. No, you know, from where I'm sitting now, to do that just for, there's probably better ways to enjoy your time rather than do that to yourself when you are so sensitive. But I've noticed that even in argument, you know, interpersonal argument, you know, my wife can come to me and, you know, this is, you got to change the baby's nappy or whatever. We get in some sort of exchange. I actually move now intuitively and I don't hold it. You know what I mean? Like, we had a bit of a traumatic event with the baby, and there was an incident, and something that I know would have left me really tense by the, like, really strung out by the, and I noticed that, you know, whilst not always the most socially acceptable thing in this cultural context, I moved when I felt I didn't suppress the movements during this process, and, you know, they're pouring out of me all the time. And at the end of that day, I didn't feel like I'd been hit by a truck of nervous energy. I felt like I dealt with the day as it happened. And I don't know if, you know, the relationship between us and movement earlier was more like that. I sort of have a bit of an intimation that our modern culture is a bit overly still and rigid. You know what I mean? We're a bit like, you know, in the movie theater, don't move, elbows in, you know, tuck in, like sort of a bit of a constipated culture in terms of movement. But what I see happening at your retreats and what I see happening to me now is, if I'm in a great conversation on the phone, I'm all over the shop. You know what I mean? And then it flows through me and it's a bit of an ecstasy. Or if I'm in an argument and, you know, if I move, it doesn't live in me and I don't hold on to it, which is a real quirk. You know what I mean? It seems to be a bit of a strange thing from how we normally conceptualize things, but the reality for me is absolutely incontrovertible that if I move throughout intense experiences, I don't no longer hold on to them anymore and end up bunched up by them. I'm able to dance with them, and does that makes any sense to you from
Yeah,
that sort of
totally.
perspective?
Absolutely. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Well, you know, after all, this is the importance of the movement, vibration in that case, right? Vibration, movement, has been utilized by many therapists. Some of them are very well known in North America, in spiritual circles. Peter Levin created a whole body of work based on that. The only difference, of course, is that movements are facilitated from the outside. So, in other words, it's, I would say, well, I hope listeners will understand, it's not assessment of the work, but it's a level down. They are not spontaneously arising movements. They are movements that the body is subjected to. So, in other words, they are facilitated from the outside. But even that, excuse me, is considered to be bringing tremendous benefits to those who need to loosen up. And the loosening up here is always paramount to freeing the system from accumulated stresses. And Peter Levin is just one example. There are many others who have developed and working in developing this, the importance of that. We know that the future of all, perhaps in that respect, balanced way of life is sound. So in other words, there's nothing new about that. I'm saying future, it's simply going back to what we knew for millennia prior to that. So it's back to sound. Sound is what really coagulates everything. Sound is what creates stress, and sound is what frees us. So this is all in the domain of sound, domain of frequencies. Body simply responds to that. So even the bodily movements can be seen as a response to internal vibrations.
Yeah.
So what we experience ourselves when we are in the midst of that, or what others can witness, right? And in the case of like your partner can see you shaking or moving, right? Is the manifestation of the amplification of internal frequency. And that frequency, always there, as it were, requires to be at a certain velocity for greater capacity to integrate at all times. Because as soon as the integration is diminished, that's where the coagulation and viscosity sets in. And in the viscosity, there is, of course, naturally the propensity for stress to get set into the system, right? Whatever is viscose, let alone becomes like a paste, can leave imprint. And that imprint with that, whatever that form is, further crystallizes and there we go. It's like it's a certain form. You see, whereas in fact, it's just an experience. An experience is something pressing into the system. So the system has to always be in a state of its utmost velocity so as to vibrate with the experience. And this way, we can speak about it maybe as what could be considered to be the ultimate utmostly desired state, to be in a state of such velocity that we are never under the impact of our experiences to the degree where the experience and experiencer are separated.
Yeah. It's a
Always
resonance.
one. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Resonance is the term. Very well.
Yeah.
So there is a constant resonance, because when there's no resonance, a lack of resonance, dissonance, right, is the opposite of that. And dissonance causes discord, disharmony, and all that whole heap of things.
Tension.
So that's what you shared. And
Contraction.
that's what it is. Yeah, that's what it is. Exactly.
Yeah.
So very much so.
That makes a lot of sense, and and I hadn't really, I'd felt that was a big piece of the puzzle, but the way that you've put it there is just exactly it. Probably the last thing that I'd be curious about your thoughts on. I appreciate that I've taken up a good chunk of your time here. It would be, how do you interface with, so the only label that I could find for what my body was doing was Kriya Yoga, right? And you've got practitioners of, I'm not sure if it's just Kriya Yoga, but that's the one where, I even after just reading the description, I knew that it was the one. They were talking about like mechanical leverage and bone structure, and like it was clearly it, you know what I mean? Because there's a lot of aspects to this stuff that are rolling on the bone structure and leverage and different stuff that's very interesting and very it can be frightening as well. But so how do you relate to people that practice that? Because obviously my first notion was to reach out to these Kriya people. I saw a woman doing some movements that looked familiar to me, and I raced over to her and waited till she was done doing what she was doing, and I was like, what are you doing? You know what I mean? Can you tell me anything about it? And she said it was Kriya Yoga, and then I reached out to some Kundalini yoga people. There didn't seem to be any of it arising naturally there. There didn't seem to be any sophistication intrinsic to those disciplines where they were like, oh yeah, we do this, but it also happens naturally or whatever. It seemed that almost it had been co-opted by those traditions and into, this is something that we do, but you don't just do this. Like you couldn't just do that. Like, it was invented by this guy, and you know what I mean? There was a lineage, and from where I'm sitting, I had the incontrovertible internal data that you're wrong. Like we all have this in us. Like you thought you learnt this, but you already had it. You've learnt it again, you know what I mean? But it was already in there, because if it's in me, I don't have any sort of delusions of grandeur that this would be something that is only intrinsic to my consciousness. And I think it's embedded in all of us, embedded in the body, an understanding of this way of transmuting energy and relating to the world. But it's, how do you conceptualize the people that are practitioners of that versus it's because from the outside, and especially to the uninitiated, you may even be lumped in with that. You know what I mean? And it's a sort of, oh yeah, you're doing what they're doing, but it is a very different process in terms of the unfoldment, and there's not a lot of space, at least that I found from the outside and not going deep in their traditions, for an acknowledgement of this being a spontaneous arising. So, I'd be curious to get your thoughts in terms of, how do you frame that? Do you think that that's a reasonable practice and they're sort of on the money and then they'll naturally tap into it spontaneously? Or would they be no more likely really to catalyze this without creating a conscious vessel, like say sort of what you're doing in your retreats with really encouraging and creating a space for this? Because a lot of them, I assume within their frameworks, it's still fairly rigid, if you know what I'm saying, you know what I mean, versus the spontaneous sense. So I just, lob over that nonsense again and see if you pass it and make some sense out of it.
Well, I'm going to be sounding, and I'm taking the risk, of course, yet again, sounding biased and dismissive, because it's quite frankly, has nothing to do with the processes we've been speaking about, which have the, let's just put it, called spade a spade, divine origin. This is all mentally come up with orchestrated body of exercises, and some of them, no doubt, could have and do have therapeutic, I would say, benefits, as any movement. Any good movement has a therapeutic, it's better to move, not to move. We know that, right? You body need to move. Your body, move it, man. Right? So, let's just make it very clear. But if someone claims that these movements are, and the hip hop, the list of these claims, and I've spoken about it from day one almost, because when I came out and started working with people already, a lot of people came also from these very same movements, the Kundalini yoga, the Kriya yoga, and these people had a real visceral awakening, and they knew the difference, and they wanted further guidance, they wanted further reassurance, they wanted to have continuation of the journey. And of course, in no time, it became very clear how all this is based on, again, marketability, how all this is driven by supply and demand, cleverness, and coming up with all this, let's say, extraordinary benefits. And again, yes, if the benefits are just moving the body, well, you know what? I've got a few kettlebells down there, Russian style. Since Pavel Tsatsulin brought it to the United States some 2 decades, or maybe more, kettlebells are being cast out of iron everywhere. Every gym has kettlebells, but they are native to Russia and China, but Russian kettlebells are more known. So I prefer to go and do that properly, with full awareness of that. It's good for my age as well. There has to be a bit of a resistance and strain on the bone structure, right? So that there's absorption of calcium. I've done yoga teacher training courses in my early 30s, I could forge out a career of being a yoga teacher, but I was still a painter. And so I was never interested in that. So yes, if I want to stretch my body, I know how to do it. But I also know, I'm fully aware, I've read enough, I've conversed enough, and did my research, that 90% of all Hatha yoga postures that are a curriculum of all these yoga studios around the world are all gymnastics. Many of them came from British military gymnastics, which were incorporated into the body of asanas by few key people who set this whole movement on, and the West took on it. This is not yoga that we speak of. It has nothing to do with the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, nothing to do with Patanjali Yoga. It is invented in our modern day and age. Just as when we speak about Kensho experience, this Japanese term for glimpse of enlightenment. Kensho is not native to Japan, but how many people know that? Kensho is a Western psychological concept brought into Japan. So what we're touching upon here, I would suggest maybe for some future research for you or conversation, what we touched upon here is a phenomena of intellectual colonialism that we were subjected to as a human race for a long period of time, where all this Egyptology, Indology, Orientalism, all these kind of movements, studying native traditions from the outside in perspectives, also caused influences into these traditions. There are works, scholarly works, on the influence of Christian thought into the body of Hinduism. There are works of how Japanese Zen was influenced by psychological thought, Western thought. So there's constant flux. So separating wheat from the chaff is very difficult.
Yeah.
But why I gave example of Kensho. Kensho doesn't exist in within the Japanese culture. It was invented, brought in, the term took on, was transported back across the Pacific into the soil where it came from, into America. And people are regurgitating and throwing these terms, today as if it's somehow deeply rooted in the tradition of Japan itself. It is not.
Yeah.
Likewise here, all these Kriya sort of oriented movements, Kundalini yoga or Kriya yoga, all these exercises are invented, created, came up with so as to give the body of work, right? So that you have to come with something substantial. You see? So now this is where the bias I will be held against, is that in my work, there's nothing to hold on to. And that's what makes it very difficult for people. Oh, what is your work then? Well, you know what? It's not what you think of. It's not something you can grab and put it in your pocket.
Yeah.
It's constantly alive. It's like alive. It's so alive, it's not morphed into something. By the time you think it morphed into something, you better begin to dissolve it.
Yeah.
And as an opposite of that, I give these examples like, people, every attendee of our programs knows very well that at no time I ever would encourage the audience or the participants or the people who have gathered, okay, raise your hands, or try to sing, or hit that note. Why don't you try spread your legs this way? Hey, what about you go and start whirling? No, all I say is we enter into the meditating session all with a very, very ancient, perhaps the most ancient form of meditation, all based on observing one's breathing. This is traditional.
Yeah.
And we all do that. Old timers who can just go off like that, ready to go off. They don't need entrance into meditation. They are always in a meditative state, given the space and time. And yet everyone enters with the same awareness on the breath. Yes, we visit some points in the body so as to create that good entrance together. And then all I say, let the spontaneity take over. See? And none of the do this, don't do this, why don't you?
Yeah.
Why don't you start vocalizing and you be quiet? Or why don't you, do some asanas to me or do some kriyas or do some. So this is why we have now coined out this term. And I have announced this in our last online Q&A gathering back in December, which is finally, after the many years, we decided to literally customize that still rarely spoken term, samavesha. And with regard to our work, it's an all-encompassing, very, very peculiar, complex term, 17 definitions in Sanskrit dictionary for that. But we apply that in relation to three main aspects: samavesha as immersion, samavesha as penetration, and samavesha as possession or repossession. Because we want to define this work. I'm tired, frankly, having to go over and over of this is not the kriya of so-and-so. What we do here is not the kriya of so-and-so.
Yeah.
So, but the lack of terms, we use the word kriyas, we used to add spontaneous, involuntary, but people still don't get that. If people haven't been in the programs, they still assume that they're somehow facilitated by some conscious efforts, actions.
Yeah, but it's completely different. Yeah, I understand and respect that, and there is a poverty of language around these things. I think it's a good idea to co-opt your own set of sort of linguistic tools to add to the belt there, because it's the weird overlap, the confusing overlap with kriyas, I think, is the person who came up with that particular branch of yoga included some of the intuitive ones. Yes. You know what I mean? Yes. And so they were tapping in. The first guy probably wasn't even hiding that. You know what I mean? He would have been like, yeah, this is a couple my body cooked up on its own. We'll put these in here. And then people have sort of added to it, like the Bible. You know what I mean? There's all of these extra stories and things added on. And now what's exported, totally, as you're saying, it is a product and a commodity. And if you were to do that, it would even probably verge over into dangerous, you know what I mean, if you were to try and coax people into some of these positions, because I've heard you speak on before that the safety of it is because it's guided by that sacred sort of intuitive knowledge, and in the absence of that, it would be you'd be in trouble, sort of thing. If you were to try and do some of the movements that the body will do on its own, it seems like it would be like a not advisable. You know what I mean? To coax someone into some of these positions.
Well, yeah, yes, and not even that. Not even that. It's even worse than that, because what am I mean by that is that in fact this movement's supposed to facilitate what the ultimate promise is. But when people go through spontaneous awakening or awakening within that framework, the community, the system has no steps, no curriculum, no knowledge to guide these people. This is what we're talking about. So when all this is, let's say, gymnastics, suddenly, let's say, facilitate true awakening, which it's all argumented, debatable whether that is the case. But let's say it facilitated now the release of pranic force, and it now get unleashed. It doesn't need to do all this. It doesn't need to all this like enforced breathing, holding of the breath, movements and so forth, contortion of the body. Suddenly it all now, then there's no guidance. And that's what happens. So in other words, it's almost like the baby is thrown out with the bathtub water, because that what it aims, and the very title, let's say the term Kundalini yoga, when Kundalini herself, the goddess, begins to rise, let's say in her majesty, suddenly there's no guidance because nobody knows what to do. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah. So and that would almost be the most chaotic version of it, because you're ostensibly in the place where they know what to do. You know what I mean? So if in that place they don't know what to do, it's where am I going to go? So it would be you'd be backed up. And I think that it's really important, the bit that you speak about, to how dynamic and evolving it is. People sort of want something that they can put in their pocket and do on every Wednesday morning and with the sunrise and all of that sort of thing. But throughout early parts of this process, any time that my mind would try and take over and assist and be like, oh, I see what you're doing, we're doing this, it would be very quickly, there was almost a frustration of like, no, we weren't about to do that, and you're getting in the way, and sort of like it would, every time, I'd be like, no, we've done this 8 times now, I know what we're going to do, and it would always be a stern sort of activating inhibitory muscles being like, stop, that's not it. And then it would change, you know what I mean? And the next day I would sit and expect a similar thing to happen. It'd be completely different. It'd be doing something with my left feet, you know what I mean? And it'd just be a full, so anytime you try and hold it, it slips through your fingers.
It's that like Qigong story. You see, it's like, 1,000 people in sync doing something, and it looks very pictorial, it looks very photogenic, it's very filmable. And it indeed looks beautiful, stadium of people doing the same movements at the same time, right? Like on the Olympics. When suddenly 2, 3, 4 people rolling on a floor instead, that doesn't kind of look symmetrical anymore, right? But that rolling is the divine act. That's what the prana is now needs to do. Me doing all these gestures, right? It's all good. All the tai chi, it's fantastic. But if this is now what next step, next level, or what is required, right? What is the true medicine of the moment denied, then this is unscientific. It's not spiritual. It's not sacred. It's certainly not chaste, and it's just enforcement again. And if that happens in the organization, even if it's 50 people doing the same thing and suddenly someone comes up with them, they there and then break out of the system. And that's what we spoke about at the very beginning, how this has always been and continues to be very difficult to box, very difficult to define, very difficult to niche because of its unpredictability, uniqueness, freedom of display. Yes, combining all register and all the diapason. So it's, it's, we are not wired to that in our day and age right now.
Yeah.
You see, not everyone grew up in the culture of heavy metal, hard rock, and can withstand, let's say, like, I'm just giving this to lighten up the mood, that, it's, some people find it, well, I don't want it. Give me back my peaceful life, I want to be still.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, this is also another story of me coming across some people who had beautiful awakenings, but just because of their somehow still mental setup, they just were seeking for guidance from me, not how to go further, but how to go back. And that was very, very bizarre. And to me, I found it very hard to understand. Give me back my life, with my Porsche, with my job, with my, everything. It's like, I want stability. I don't want this. I know I respect spiritual people. Why me? I didn't go to retreats, man. Give me that pill back or the key, whatever. Can we go back? See?
Yeah.
No, there's no go back to evolution. Like nature and consciousness work in sync. They're not two different realities.
Yeah.
So if something evolves and it requires these cathartic moments of realignment, which comprises in itself, certainly through a certain phase, a chaos, we have to roll with that. We have to ride that hurricane, in the words of the Lao Tzu. We have to be able to be in that mode which brings the most extraordinary transformation. Then, in retrospect, as in many cases in myself, certainly, it was all worthwhile. What an extraordinary journey it is. It's just so magnificent. But at the time, yes, there were moments when one would really question one's sanity, everything. But that's part and parcel of growing up, man. This is part and parcel of, my kids. I fathered 5 children. The middle ones, they're teenagers. It's a difficult phase to grow up. One is 17 now, another one is 14.
Yeah.
It's like going through this. It's not easy. It's not easy to become a grown-up person.
Yeah.
So, of course, it's likewise not easy to grow into that, let's say, next level, from this, let's say, level of whatever that is, spiritual puberty to spiritual maturity.
Yeah. Yeah. And that sort of analogy is, I think it hits really close to home, because there is a bit of a, in the same way that, a teenager has to individuate and relate to the peer group and move out into the world, there's a shedding of the cultural conditions if you're to go your own way here. You know what I mean? Like, if you're to really embrace these sorts of processes, you have to step out of the cultural container that doesn't have space for things like this. You know what I mean? They understand, you want to be a lawyer, you want to do this, yeah, we got places for you. Like, that's cool. We've got, double thumbs up. But if you start to follow the path of the heart, or these sorts of called into these other spaces, they're adjacent to culture. You know what I mean? And so there's a process of maturation to be able to walk, and it can feel at times very lonely. You know what I mean? I think in navigating the path of where you feel called to, irrespective of the where else the other signposts are pointing, familial, cultural, whatever, they're almost never going to point you straight arrow down where you should be heading. You know what I mean? And where you feel really called to head. But it takes courage to walk that. I'm respectful of your time here, Igor. We've run long. I've had a fantastic conversation. I think it's been really insightful, connected a lot of dots for me, and filled in a few blanks. And really appreciate the body of knowledge you've developed around this area. And it's awesome work that you're doing. I think it's really crucially important, because, as you're saying, this is going to happen to more and more people. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I don't think there's any stopping that. And I think the only way out, both on the individual and the larger scale here, the more macro lens, is the only way out is in and through. You know what I mean? And that's I think that's inarguable. And so this sort of work is crucial. Hopefully, in our own little way, this conversation can be a resource for people as well to get a little bit of guidance. And I'll pop your website and your YouTube channel in there for people so they can go and check out your stuff. Is there any other stuff you'd want to close with or anything, Igor?
Well, I think we've covered pretty much of the ground enough to reflect on. I don't want to do any overload, and I'm not in favor of last words of kind of like, I don't want to be a postman delivering any final message. I think it's like just, it's a beautiful journey we are on. It's magical, mysterious, and in retrospect, I feel, the older I get, the more novelty there is, rather than a sense of like seeing it all. At some point, I was old man in my late 20s, so it's like, and that's, to me, we need to embrace really ourselves for this, what everyone speaks about, right? The dawn of a particularly importance of the new culture that we will conceive within ourselves in that in the world of post-religious, right, post-imperial kind of setup, where we need to kind of really attentively cast out our journey for the next 7 generations, so that so it's, to me, it's like balancing act. What a balancing act this is. So yes, this quickening, this awakening that one can go individually, it's an extraordinary opportunity to face this individually within, so as to then perhaps be placed in that where that can be communicated through whatever way, form, gesture, action, that it is there. So there we go. I got the last word.
Yeah, they were pretty good. Seeing as you don't like them, you're pretty good at them. And thanks again for your time, Igor. It's a really honest.
It was great. Yeah, I really appreciate that, and for facilitating this, and best of luck with your development of your podcast. I can see it as a potentially really worthwhile resonance and repercussions out there. So.
Yeah, thanks, Igor. And it all depends on the graciousness of people like you giving your time. So it's not unappreciated that you take the time to speak with me. And hopefully one day in the future we may even meet. I might come to one of the immersions, and I could see that being as a beautiful experience.
Well, yes, God's willing, and you're most welcome.